Welcome to Sense and Sensibility, the Inflation Guy podcast. I am Michael Ashton. I am the Inflation Guy, and I am your host. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about rents and how rents enter into the calculation of inflation indices. I guess you could call this episode, and I guess I will call this episode, Rents and Sensibility. So, rents are the biggest portion of the consumer price index. Actually, they're the biggest portion also of PCE and pretty much every other price index, because shelter is sort of the first thing, the most important thing that we buy is a roof to put over our heads, I guess, after food. And it's one of the most expensive things. And so it has a very large weight in the consumption basket. It turns out that the weight in the consumer price index is a lot higher than it is in the personal consumption expenditures index, the PCE that the Fed uses. But that's not really the topic of our conversation today. The bottom line is it's a very large weight in both indices. And so getting that part of the basket right matters. You know, if you have a small category of 0.1%, and you don't quite figure out correctly how to measure that inflation for that tiny little piece, it's not all that important. But when you're talking about 40% of core inflation, if you mess that up, then your inflation index is just going to be wildly wrong. And so it's sort of really important that we get that number approximately correct. And yet, there are lots of people who think that the way that the BLS calculates rents and the cost of shelter is wrong. And it makes some people very, very angry. You know, there are still some bozos out there who lament the change that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, made to the calculation of shelter inflation way back in 1983. And these people claim that, the government has essentially hidden a tripling of prices that we just didn't notice over those 40 years by systematically reporting too low a number for shelter. It's absurd, and I will probably return to this point over and over again over the next weeks, months, years, because it really is sort of crazy, and it's very easy to prove that those assertions are incorrect, but somehow it still persists. Again, it's coming up on 40 years since the BLS changed the treatment of owner-occupied housing in the CPI, and we have an answer that we have a way to calculate rents that makes some sense, and I'm going to explain to you why it makes some sense, and hopefully convince you. So, there are two in shelter. There's sort of two ways that people consume shelter. One is, three ways if you count living with your parents, but that doesn't get into the CPI. So one way is to rent your residence. Okay, we call this rent of primary residence. And that means that you either rent an apartment or you rent a home directly, but you don't actually own the thing that you're renting. So we're going to start with that piece. That's a smaller piece than the owner-occupied housing, and we'll get to that in just a second. But let's first look at primary rents. This is topical now because surveys of primary rents right now, of asking rents, are rising at something like 16% or 18% or 20% over the last 12 months. And a lot of people are confused about why that number is not getting into the CPI. And again, there's the people who think that it's a big conspiracy that, rents in the CPI are only going up at 3% and rising or something like that instead of going up at 18%. But there's a very good reason for that. There's good reasons for all these things. You just have to dig into the number a little bit and understand how this all happens and why it happens. And remember that the CPI is a weighted average basket concept. So it's a weighted average of all of the different consumers. So if you think about rents going up, let's suppose 16% to make the calculation easy here. And let's suppose that 25% of the people in the country move in a given year, and they face a 16% higher cost of their rent, and everyone else doesn't move. Then in the basket, in the CPI, that rent of primary residence will be a quarter of the 16% that's being measured, or roughly 4%. And so there's really two components here when you're looking at these surveys of asking rents rising and rising and rising. And one of them is what's the turnover of renters? And if the turnover of renters is very, very low, then even a very high increase in asking rents doesn't translate into a very high CPI. So normally the CPI for primary rents moves along with asking rents. It just moves at a fraction, a delta of that has something to do with what the turnover is of renters. Now, this does introduce some problems when you have very large changes in rents. You can imagine that when asking rents are going up at 20% per year, you should have less turnover. You're more likely to sort of sit on that apartment that you don't really love, but the landlord's only going to increase you 3% this year instead of going out to find another apartment that's going to be 20% more expensive. And it's not clear that this gets captured really well in the CPI, but this is sort of a second order effect, and we don't worry too much about it. And then, of course, there's also sort of the one-off effects, like, will people move less because of COVID? And that's probably the case. People are probably going to move less because of COVID. And again, it's not really clear that gets captured in the right way. But usually CPI and asking rents do move together, not at the same level. What's interesting is that since essentially August of 2020, asking rents and rent to primary residence have not moved together. Asking rents and realized rents have not moved. And there's a very clear reason why this has happened. And that is that at the end of the summer of 2020, when most of the country had been on lockdown for quite a time, the CDC declared an eviction moratorium. And they said, you can't, it doesn't matter if somebody doesn't pay or trashes the apartment or whatever, you can't evict them except in very, very limited circumstances. And so what that meant was, two things. One is that there was very, very, very little turnover. And so the fact that asking rents were very high, it didn't really matter because there were very few people actually paying asking rents. But the other problem was that the way the BLS calculates rents, they go and they ask landlords, how much rent has been collected on this unit and how much do you expect to eventually collect on this unit? And if the answer is, this guy's a deadbeat and the CDC says I can't evict him and so I don't think he's ever going to pay, then that becomes a zero in the rental survey. Now, there weren't a lot of zeros, but there were a number of less than 100% numbers. And it doesn't take too many 40% offs to really affect the annual rate of change. And so that's the main thing that happened, is that we get this artificial depressing of the rental survey. And my belief, and I think a kind of widespread belief, is that now that the eviction moratorium has been thrown out a couple of times now, that we're going to start to see measured rents in the CPI start to catch up where they might otherwise have been. Furthermore, we still have these large changes in asking rents, and so increased turnover means that those are going to pass more and more into the CPI as well. And so over the next 6 months, we don't really know how fast this is going to happen, but over the next 6 months, 12 months, you're going to see rent in the CPI go up substantially, in the order of 4.5%, 5.5%, which will cause core CPI to be much higher than it otherwise would be. And part of that's just a catch up, and part of it reflects great strength in the housing market. So let's talk about the housing market, because the other part of rents, that was rent of primary residence, that you go and you pay rent to a landlord. And so that's pretty easy to understand, and you can imagine how you go about surveying it. And you can look on the BLS website, bls.gov/CPI, and they have all kinds of papers, and they explain in great detail, very mind-numbing detail, how they go about collecting the rental survey. I'm not going to go into that here because my job is not to numb your mind, but to fill it. So the next part of rent, and the bigger part, is owner's equivalent rent. And this is the part where people get really angry, upset. And they say, look, home prices are rising at 20% year on year, according to the Case-Shiller Index, but almost any survey of housing prices you look at. Why isn't owner's equivalent rent going up at 20%? Because the cost of houses, the value of housing is going up that fast. And it really is not actually as much an answer. The answer isn't entirely about turnover, like our answer for primary rents was. It is in a way, but not directly. The real problem, and what's really confusing to a lot of people, is that when you buy a house, when you buy a home, you actually are buying two things. Okay, so you've just bought your nice house behind the white picket fence and all that, and you have two things. One is you've bought a service, you've bought shelter, and the other thing that you've bought is an asset that someday you'll be able to sell again. And so the recognition in the early 1980s was that you have to separate those two things, that the value of the asset can change quite a bit, and it doesn't mean that your cost of shelter is changing a whole lot. And by the way, it arguably you can make the same argument for things like, for other durable goods. For example, automobiles. You buy mobility when you buy a car, but you also buy an asset, and eventually you'll resell the car. So you can make a very similar argument, but in the case of a car or a refrigerator or a washing machine, those things depreciate at a much more rapid rate. So it's less of a problem if you sort of ignore the fact that you own an asset and the resale value, and treat it like it's more of a consumer expense, a current expense. So, but does it make sense to go and separate these two pieces, the ownership part and the rental part? Well, let's think about somebody who is just entering into the shelter market. Why would somebody who is just buying shelter for the first time, so he's just left his mom and dad's basement and he's buying shelter for the first time, and he faces a choice between buying a home, a nice, humble, modest home, taking out a mortgage and going and buying a home, or going and renting a nice place. And looking at those two, cash outlays and taking on a large liability for buying a home, and home prices have just gone up 20%. That's on one side of the ledger, and on the other side of the ledger, he says, okay, well, rents are high, but I know that if I rent a place that, they're not going to keep going up 20% while I live there, and so, I know that my cost of living in that apartment will only go up, 4% a year or something on average over the next couple of years. Why would that person go and buy a home as opposed to renting? The answer, which is immediately obvious if you've ever bought a home, is that in the first case, you own something, right? You actually have something which at the end of the time you've lived there has some residual value. So yes, you're paying for your mortgage, and yes, you've taken on this large debt, but you end up getting something out of that. And it isn't just the shelter, it is the asset. So that there clearly is something different about a home compared to an apartment that you're living in. And so it makes sense that certainly consumers do place a different value on a home. They impute something other than just a place to live in a home that they're going to own. That ownership does mean something. It does have some value. And so that's why it does make some sense to try and separate these two things out. And so what the BLS essentially does is say, let's try to separate out these things. How does an economist look at these two things? And for that matter, how does a trader think about a bundled transaction? Really, I was a derivatives guy for many years, and a derivatives trader thinks about these things in a similar way. If you have a sort of weird derivative that you're trying to figure out, one of the things that you do is you say, well, what kind of pieces can I put together which will give me the same net payoff in all circumstances as the thing that I'm trying to buy? And then that collection of things that equal the same thing, I can add up all those prices and I should be able to get to the price of the derivative. And essentially, economists are doing the same thing when they look at owner-occupied housing. So they say, okay, imagine these two equivalent situations. In one case, you own a home and you live in the home. Very simple. Okay, and we've stipulated that we believe that means that you're getting two things. You're getting an asset and you're getting rent. But how do we separate these things? So the equivalent situation is you own a home, but instead of living in the home, you rent out that home, and you use the rent that you collect to rent an apartment that you live in, so that the rents net out. Now, these circumstances are equivalent in that in both cases you own a home, in both cases you acquire shelter. But now we can see that there's two very clear cash flows here, two very clear components to the transaction. And one of them, you can simply look at the rent that you're charging and the rent that you're paying is clearly the cost of your shelter. And in the other, you still have the home, you still have the asset. And that's effectively then what we're doing is, and so when the BLS goes and they say you own a home, but we're going to look at what it would cost you to rent a home. Some people get upset about that. They think that we're going around and asking individuals, well, how much do you think your home would rent for? And that's not the way it works. But that's effectively what we're trying to do is separate out and say, what does a rental of this unit really end up looking like? Now, the BLS has been doing this, as I said before, for almost 4 decades, and it works very well. Many, many other countries use a similar method. There are some countries that still use a mortgage rate or a blended mortgage rate as a way of measuring the cost of owner-occupied housing, and this makes some intuitive sense because it is kind of what you're paying out of pocket. At least on average around the country, the average mortgage rate, is something like what you're having to pay for that owner-occupied housing in a way. You can see that introduces other problems. What happens if you buy a home for cash? Then what's your cost of living in the home? 0? That doesn't make any sense. We just sort of established that the answer is not 0. And you also introduce this recursion problem that if the level of mortgage rates affects your measurement of CPI and your measurement of inflation then affects your mortgage rates, then you end up with this problem. And the problem is that you're affecting the thing that you're trying to measure. And obviously we don't really want to try to do that. So in a nutshell, the BLS says that whether you live in an apartment or you live in a home, you are paying rent, and that's consumption. When you pay rent, you're paying it to the owner of the asset. The only difference is that when you own the home, The asset owner is you. So it makes sense. And sensibility. And now you understand the largest weight in the consumer price index. I hope that was helpful. If you enjoyed or were educated by this podcast, please subscribe. Download the Inflation Guy app that's in your Google Play Store or your Apple Store. If you want to send me a message, you can send me a message from the Inflation Guy app, or you can go to our website, www.enduringinvestments.com, and you can fill out the contact form, send me a comment there. If you're curious about what else I do and what else my company does, then you can go to that website, enduringinvestments.com, and poke around. And again, if you're interested in finding out anything more, you can send me a note. Thanks for tuning in to Sense and Sensibility. Again, I am Michael Ashton. I am the Inflation Guy. My message to you, as always, is defend your money. If inflation is coming for you, remember, you know a guy.